Welcome to the Unshadowed Thought Podcast with James Hall. This podcast is dedicated to Michelle Goyevich, Ed White, Caitlin Treacle, and the countless others that have lost their lives as a direct result of psychiatric harms. I'm starting this podcast to explore the things we don't really talk about. For me, I was hurt by transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it took me a long time to open up about it. But now that I did, it exposed this whole new realm of truth and radical acceptance in my life that I really strive to share with everybody else. So in the spirit of that, I've noticed that there's so many different aspects of our life that could really benefit from the same thing. There's other aspects of psychiatry that should be talked about in an honest way. There's tons of other things that drive people to psychiatry: our jobs, our lives, our health, the way we think. And what I found in my life was that people weren't talking about these things enough, and inevitably it ended up putting people in a bad situation where they ended up doing things that were not that healthy, and it didn't have the greatest results. Me seeking TMS treatment is a perfect example of that. On this cast, I'll share my TMS story and the journey I've been on since that time. But perhaps more importantly, I want to explore all these other aspects of our lives and how they influence us. I also want to explore the path that leads us down. I want to explore pharma. I want to explore the whole phenomenon of medical devices, how they get approved, and how doctors use them and how we experience them, and then what we do about it, because people do have negative experiences. I had a horrific experience with transcranial magnetic stimulation, and as a result of that, I ran into and explored a whole community of people that have been severely injured by psychiatric drugs and treatments, and people don't really talk about that. It's not cool. It's not right. So this cast is meant to explore those things, all the topics that surround it, and any other topic that needs the light of truth shed on it and that we could find as objectively as possible here. So here's some of the ground rules. Everything is going to be as honest as possible on this cast. I will do my absolute best to verify the truth that we share, the testimony that's shared here. And to that end, there's going to be no money exchanged for this podcast. There's no financial interests. There's no marketing interests. There's no personal interests here for me in any way, except for to share the truth with people so that they can make decisions with their life that are the most impactful as possible with the least amount of deception. So on this journey, I'm going to bleep out any serious language that comes about and give trigger warnings. I don't want to negatively impact anybody any more than I have to, because some of the topics we're going to talk about, they're going to be taboo. They're going to be examining the darker side of life, which is incredibly important to me because people hid these darker sides of life from me, and it ended up being to my detriment. If I would have understood the consequences for the way I was living my life and the dangers of seeking treatment basically in secret, then I certainly would have made vastly different choices than I did, and I certainly would have benefited from the counsel of others during that time. But I think one thing we're indoctrinated into, at least in this generation, is keeping quiet, handling your problems on your own. And historically, I think the best results that we've seen are when problems are handled in groups where we're transparent about our problems. People share the same problems that they've had, similar problems, and the outcomes. So we can make the best choices possible as individuals and as a collective. And it's this kind of framework that I want to emphasize in this podcast, that as a tribe, as a group, with transparency, with kindness, compassion, patience, fortitude, and complete honesty, We can really make short work of a lot of these really serious problems a lot of us have developed in our lives and go forward. I think I'm going to keep this cast fairly brief. I'll give you some backstory on myself, and then the first episode after this will probably be what happened to me and what put me into this position to want to make this podcast. And then we'll go from there. We'll start covering progressively more important topics after I establish this kind of baseline of what to expect and what you'll get out of it. I plan on extensively covering other survivor stories from the psychiatric community. I would love to have guests on that have survived other unpleasantness of the medical community, people that have had failed medical devices, failed medical procedures. If I can, I'd like to get medical researchers on the show, people that have seen behind the curtain. I've talked to a lot of them, and they've verified my suspicions about what goes on behind the scenes. There's also this legal perspective that people don't know about that I spent a lot of time on and gained a lot of knowledge and experience with. There's things that just don't make it into the public eye that do make it into courtroom proceedings, and if you talk to lawyers for long enough, they'll disclose this stuff to you that really shows the true nature of what goes on in a medical setting in a lot of situations. That being said, there's a flip side to all this. There's how do we heal from these accidents, these misfortunes, and that's a really big piece of it. So I plan on covering that in depth. One thing that I've always been really big on is if you see a problem, come up with a solution. And I intend to suggest and share experiences of solutions with all the different problems that we'll look at and examine. So not only understanding what's going on as clearly as possible, but also taking a look on what we can do about it for ourselves and for, society at large. When I was harmed by TMS, the biggest question on my mind was, what can I do to help other people avoid this mistake, or at least understand what they're getting into before they do? Because what I found, unfortunately, was that the informed consent that I got for transcranial magnetic stimulation before I went in there was almost zero. They were not honest with me. I know they had seen unpleasant side effects before, and I know people had disclosed unpleasant side effects to them, both at the governmental level to the FDA, and then also to the manufacturer, and also to the clinic that I went to. And none of those were disclosed to me before I accepted treatment. I had a small form that I filled out and signed that said there's an extremely rare chance of seizure, and the most common side effect was a small headache that would resolve rather quickly. And it's this kind of negligence or lack of disclosure that I've seen across every practice, every medical treatment that I've explored, every procedure, every story that I've heard from patients. It's all been this echo of the same story of not getting all the information they should have had up front. And there's something profoundly wrong with that. And there's something behind it. And I want to explore that so everyone understands, or at least the people that get to listen to this cast, they know the reality of what's going on out there, and they'll have the knowledge to keep themselves and their loved ones, their friends, and their families safe. Because what I've come to learn as well is there's a few people that I've met that have said, not necessarily I told you so, but we had time together in an earlier part of my life where they tried to show me this cautious way of living and this really objective way of scrutinizing things. And I took it to heart at the time, but I always became convinced by someone else that it wasn't that important, that I should trust doctors implicitly, that the medical establishment was this grand thing that had the answers to all your problems. If you're mentally uncomfortable or you have a pain in your body, you go see a doctor and they'll fix it for you. And it's just I haven't found that to be true. Almost everyone I talk to that has had experience looking for solutions in the medical world have had a similar or worse experience than I have. And it's really important to know that, to understand it. And if you do have a good understanding of that, it's pretty easy to keep yourself safe and to live a long and happy life. And that's what I aim to give people that are willing to listen. There are a lot of opinions on this stuff. I've worked really hard to try to take the most informed and thoughtful perspective for myself, but I want to acknowledge that a lot of the things that we talk about here will be subjective, but you cannot escape the subjectivity of life. And while I will try to be as objective as possible, and I will definitely share all the objective information that I have about these topics, it's subject to my own view, but my goal is to bring on other people with other views that they can share to give everybody the most diverse information they need to try to form their own opinions and perspectives on things. Because I want to be really clear about this. The most important lesson that I've learned in this whole experience, and the most important thing that I want to impart to you, is thinking for yourself. I could care less if you listen to me. I could care less if you take what I say seriously. But what I do want is for everyone to learn that you have to think for yourself. The biggest mistake that I made in doing TMS was not a lack of consideration of the cost or the consequence, this sort of thing. It was not thinking for myself. I trusted others and I trusted the internet. And at the time I was under this impression that I could just trust other sources and everything would pan out, and that relinquishing responsibility for myself was okay. I was taught this early in life, but I had come to turn my back on it at that point in my life. But what I was taught was that you're always responsible for 100% of everything that you do. And what I came back around to is that's true. Even people in the most unpleasant situations, they're hardly functioning, of which I experienced a lot of that. I know there's people that ended up a lot worse off than I am. But even in those horrible moments when my ability to think for myself was severely impaired, if not non-existent, I accept that my fate is my own, and that the decisions that I make, even under poor circumstances, are still mine. One reason for that is that's how we learn, that's how we progress, and that's how we accept life. I'm sure there's an argument against that, but at this point, I don't see any way around it. And through the experiences of others that I've been able to observe, I think that's something that most of the people that their opinions I hold in high esteem would agree with. So this is the type of subject matter that we'll be covering. A lot of it has to do with our thought processes and how we see and absorb our environment around us, and how can we affect those things in a positive way that will make our lives as easy as possible and as simple as possible. So with that, you're already getting a little bit of an idea of where my head's at. Let me give you a little bit of my background. I was raised in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest of the United States. I experienced both rural and urban living environments, so I got the experience to compare and contrast those, which was incredibly interesting and incredibly valuable in what I learned from them and how I can apply that experience to the rest of my life. I did decent enough in school. I didn't really apply myself very well because I was distracted with social stuff. I think a lot of Americans are. Social interaction just takes such a high place in our society, what people think of you and how you interact. It's just this massive influence. For me, it swept me up, and that was most what I was concerned about with when I was at school. So even though I consider myself as could have done really well in school, I just did moderately well. I went to college for a bit, had the same kind of conflicts. I didn't take school particularly seriously, and then ended up dropping out or losing my financial aid status, so effectively got forced out. Even though my grades weren't poor, I was dropping classes because of the social stuff I had going on at the time. I worked just one or two jobs before I took on an entry-level job at a major corporation, a Fortune 10 corporation at the time in banking, and that took up the next 15 years of my life. I spent it all giving it to one company, and it was really punishing. I worked really hard under really poor conditions for a really, really long time. It ended up breaking me, and at that point in my life, everywhere I looked, all my resources at that time pointed to psychiatry, and that's how I got involved in that system, which I'll talk about more probably on the next cast. But while I was punished pretty seriously working at that company, I should have left, I'm sure, a million times over, but it really wasn't in my personality to give up. I just kept always looking for better opportunities and more ways to make things work, which was unfortunate, but I'm grateful for it now because I learned really tremendous lessons about how large corporations work, what they do, what their methodology is, how they turn the profits that they do, and what that looks like. And when I say that, what I mean is I was in data and analytics. I saw what was going on in the background. I saw how they were making their numbers work. I saw the tricks that they used to make things look better than they actually were. I saw the tricks that they used to make things work when they did not work. All those kinds of things. And at that point in my life, I thought this stuff had no value, that it was just arbitrary information that I would learn and kind of file away. But when I started looking at what big pharma was doing and what medical device companies were doing, I instantly saw that these were the same tricks, that deception in its purity really follows the same pattern. You cover up things in the same way, you leverage technology in the same way. It really all looks the same. So once you understand it and you've experienced it, then it just slaps you right in the face. One great book I read was when I was recovering from my TMS injury, once I kind of learned how to read again, was Dangerous Medicines and Organized Crime by Peter Ghosh, which I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but I'm not even going to try to do it. Just Americanize and butcher everything. Just leave it at that. But that book was incredible. It illuminated so many things for me that I had suspected. But the methodology in which Peter looked at this stuff and the things that he exposed made perfect sense to me, because I had seen these things before. I had seen these techniques being used at the highest corporate level to make things work and to make things go. And I also saw interactions with regulators from the government and how that affected things. So all this stuff just came together in this really beautiful way of understanding for myself. But obviously I paid a high price for that, but I wouldn't take it back, because that understanding brought me to the place that I'm at today. And so these are some of the things I learned in my career. I know I fast forwarded a little bit to some of my recovery, what happened during my recovery. But so at the end of my career, what ended up being the end of my career, I wasn't doing well. I was under tremendous pressure at work. There was a reorg, which is a reorganization of leadership. I had a good boss, but his new bosses were absolutely horrible. They mistreated him. They added pressure to him, on to which he had to leave work because of stress. So I can't tell you how many people I've seen stressed out of the workplace. So their leadership intentionally applies a tremendous amount of stress, an inhuman amount of stress to a person to get them to leave so they can install the leadership or the personnel that they want to. I mean, it seems like kind of this fairy tale story that only happens in really narrow kind of situations in narrow work environments, but not according to my experience. This is a really common tactic. Corporate environment is just not scrupulous. Like, the people that get ahead there are people that care for themselves and money, and they're willing to do anything that they can figure out to make it work. I've seen this at high levels of the corporate environment, but then the people that I've talked to that I had trust with at the highest levels experienced the same thing, only magnified. And they told me in great detail. It lined up with my experience and my knowledge. And so I learned quite a bit about it. So that was the environment that I was in at the end of my career. So as you can imagine, it was hostile. I had been through several of these environments during my career, which at first I didn't know what to do. I just kept working until the stress physically disabled me from working. Then I went out. But at this point, I'd been through that several times, so I knew that I'd have to try to find a way to change my situation or maybe step away from work. I was trying to work all these things out. I was trying to find a different position within the same company. That wasn't working. Lots of times it's just that doesn't work very well. That's a whole another struggle within itself, because everybody, again, wants to instill the personnel and leadership that they like, their friends, people that will do what they ask and not apply their own scrutiny to it. They won't think independently, which is also a massive problem in the American workplace. We tend to rely as much as we can on groupthink, and this is just a huge mistake. And I want to go into this in detail in another cast. What the American workplace needs is diversity and diversity of thought. We should have diverse teams where everyone has different ideas and they're not afraid to express those ideas, and they're not afraid to be really expressive about the detail of what they're thinking, because this is how complex problems are solved. They're not solved with groupthink. Groupthink leads you into the same problems over and over and over again. All the massive problems that you see, like with the financial bubble back in 2008, pharma, medical device companies, they all share the same problems. They all share groupthink. It's all this group of people that hire their buddies or people that are mentally malleable and that they can push them into doing what they want. And this is a cultural problem. It's very hard to solve, but I know there's some really brilliant entrepreneurs. There's other just really brilliant human beings out there that want to start businesses and are currently leading businesses. And they need to know that it's diversity of thought that will drive your business. And not only that, but it'll make your business immaculate. If you have employees that are passionate about what you're doing and they know they can express themselves and have no concern about backlash or repercussions, and it's just an honest, free thinking environment, they'll thrive. Your business will thrive. Everything will just go fantastically as long as everyone is kind and courteous to each other. There's always a little bit of a caveat, but I've been in teams before as well where people have great ideas, but they're not kind about them. So it's a lot to ask to have a diverse team and everybody to be kind and thoughtful to each other. But this is where we should be pushing for this kind of environment. We should be pushing kindness and thoughtfulness in the workplace, not adherence to rules and policies that shouldn't be there in the first place. But I digressed a little bit. I think it was worthwhile. However, so I was in a hostile work environment. Things were going downhill, and I went for a regular GP visit and filled out the PHQ-9, although at the time I thought it was laughable, and I still do. I asked these really arbitrary questions about depression to try to identify you so your doctor can have a conversation with you, or you can seek treatment, which psychiatric treatment from a general practitioner is a very, very dangerous business. It's a very big gray area. General practitioners have a lot on their plate. For them to understand the dangers and nuance of psychiatry is, in my opinion, way too much to ask. You have spellbinding, you have all these different phenomenon that keep patients on unpleasant medications that are having side effects, but they may not realize they're having side effects. And for a GP to catch that and to see it, or the myriad other trappings of psychiatry, is not good. It's not an easy situation. It shouldn't be expected of somebody. Even a doctor that's brilliant would have a very hard time with it. So I found myself in my GP's office. He saw the PHQ-9 scores. He saw I was moderately depressed, which I already knew. And he had a conversation with me about it. At this point in my life, I had changed from seeing medical doctors to DOs. And I found that their training is more on physical medicine instead of chemical medicines, pharmacological medicines. And it always leaned that way. I didn't know DOs exist. But when I did, I always tried to go see him. So I saw DO. He said, we could try Wellbutrin if you haven't tried that. Or there's this new thing called TMS that is non-invasive. It doesn't hurt you and all that. He gave me the whole rundown on how TMS will be in every clinician's office to treat depression, and it's so effective at treating depression. He sold me on it, is what he did, of which I now know that he was probably given that sales line or that information from TMS sales team or the manufacturer. And that's a whole nother problem. Doctors should not be given sales pitches for their patients. They should be given the honest information to share with their patients so their patients can make an informed decision. This is my example. My situation is a perfect example of why this is dangerous. I'd like to think that I'm a thoughtful person and that I do everything I can to make good decisions. And that's what I tried to do here, although I got overzealous because my doctor sold me a miracle treatment. He went so far as to say that I may never experience depressive thoughts again after this treatment. That is a heck of a sales pitch for someone that struggles with mental distress and has for a long time. So I thought about that, and when I thought about that, I latched onto the idea and I went for it. And so I looked online to see what was out there about TMS, and there was really no negatives out there at the time about TMS. And so I went after, I was like, man, if something was bad about TMS, there would have to be a lot of information out about it. There'd have to be something, right? So I dug online. I Googled. I looked in a bunch of different places. I looked at the manufacturer's website. I did about 2 days worth of research, and I couldn't come up with anything significant to deter me from doing TMS. So I did it. I called a clinic. I found a clinic in town. I went there. They continued the sales pitch on me, and I did it. I'll spend another episode going into the details of what happened, what it looked like, and how it unfolded, because I think that's really important for a lot of people, especially people that have done TMS that are going to listen to this cast. So I went in and I got TMS. I was harmed. I came out harmed. It took me a while to figure out that I was harmed. It was very, very severely and significantly harmed. And it's a really interesting feeling you get when you're harmed by something. Your doctors and clinicians are telling you you weren't harmed by something. And then you turn to the internet, you turn to people to look for answers, and there's nothing there. I thought that I was just some magical exception to the rule, and I got hurt and no one else did. But as time went on, even in my harmed state, I started to realize that was less and less likely. And I started really, really digging in online. And when I searched enough for the right keywords for days and weeks, maybe even months, I finally found a forum, an obscure forum, where people were complaining. Just a handful of people were complaining about the exact same thing that I was complaining about. And when I saw that, like, the light just went on in my head and I had this brain explosion. And I started trying to communicate with these people. And as I started communicating with them, the pieces started coming together. And I saw the similarities, and I realized that TMS had harmed us all very significantly. And so we started communicating over email. We started putting some stuff together. It made more and more sense. We were all just emailing each other randomly for a while. And then finally, I don't know who came up with the idea. One of us came up with the idea, let's start a Facebook group. And so we did that. And then once we were all in the Facebook group, we could communicate a lot more frequently, a lot more easily, and all together so we could share our ideas. And at first it seemed small, like maybe we were the only ones. But with the information that we shared, we all understood really quickly that our symptoms matched up. We were experiencing the same phenomenon. So these were not a series of isolated incidents with different kind of impacts to people. We were all experiencing the same thing, the same phenomena, and there must be more people out there. Once the Facebook group was open, people slowly started to file in, and we met more and more people that had got hurt. We weren't solicited. We didn't know how to solicit anyone to this group. We didn't know how to get the word out that if you had been hurt by TMS, there was a place to go. It was just simply a Facebook group that was visible to other people. And just by doing that, we slowly got more and more people in the group. I think we're up to just under 2,000 people in the group now. And what we've learned from that group is absolutely insane. Like, we've learned more than I could have ever expected to learn about it. When I was first hurt, I thought this was just some mystery illness that was afflicting us from this kind of magical invisible treatment. But I ended up finding out how, when and why we all got hurt and what that meant for us. And that came from community. That came from tribe. It came from being a part of a group where we shared our ideas and experiences, no matter what they were, no matter how diverse they were. We shared it all with each other. And it's unfortunate, but I think that vulnerability came from being hurt. We were all pushed beyond our limits, and we stopped acting the way we thought we were supposed to act. We all started sharing what was really going on with us. And that's when things came together. That's when incredible things started to happen. So since then, I was able to put a couple articles out in Mad in America, reading Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, along with Peter Ghosh's book, Dangerous Medicines and Organized Crime, helped me start to understand what the big picture was and that I needed to kind of get things out there more. Bob Whitaker's a fantastic person. I reached out to him and he understood what was going on. He helped me get my story published in Mad in America, and then a follow-up article I did on the how of TMS injury, how it occurs, and what's actually going on. Because what's actually going on is not what you get from the manufacturer. It's not what you get from the clinics. It's not what you get from the media. You'd be surprised how private and deceptive they are about the real mechanisms of TMS and how it works. It's really unpleasant, and they don't want you to know about it, and they don't share it. Even in scientific journals, articles, and studies, they really conceal the inner workings of TMS, and I think that's to try to keep the whole thing moving. Scientists want to use this for experiments. They don't want to bring up an ethical issue of using this on people, which in all likelihood, if you knew how it really worked, you'd probably agree that it shouldn't be used on people at all. Nobody's interested in going backwards, even though that's exactly the direction we should probably be going. So I got the articles published in MIA, which is fantastic. I'd like to thank everybody over there. I wrote in a ton of other journalists, a ton of other publications. None of them are interested in the story. There's potentially thousands, there's potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people being impacted by TMS harms. Media is not interested in the story. That's pretty disheartening. That speaks volumes to me. I can't say that I'm surprised, but that's what's unfolded. And that's led me kind of to make this podcast and do the things that I'm doing and being a part of the communities that I'm a part of, is that it's really about honesty and truth. And I found that there's a real cap, there's a real lid on that out there. And it's hyper offensive to me. There's so many things that are kept private for the sake of objectivity, the name of science, although myself and Peter will both agree that science is being extremely exploited for financial means. The science that I see out there is complete trash and garbage. I will explore that in absolute depth and honesty on this cast. My hope is that if you listen to those casts, you'll have a very good understanding of how the scientific community and engine is currently working and what they're doing to keep the honest truth from people out there, which is it's all based on this kind of irony that if you apply real science and objective thinking and learning to the studies and the science you see out there, it reveals in and of itself the flaws in what's going on. Peter's book, Dangerous Medicines and Organized Crime, is, if you can read well, it's a dry book. It's medical literature, but it's absolutely fantastic in the way that it breaks down and systematically depegs what's happening in science right now and why you can read and look through studies that seem encouraging, but there's just massive flaws in their reason and logic. And there's this departure of science from reason and logic and philosophy, and that's a really big problem. If you want to come to a sound conclusion, you need objective evidence and you need logical, reasonable evidence as well. So you need to systematically explore the possibilities of what your science is saying and what results you're getting, and then apply them in a reasonable fashion. So there's plenty of scientific experiments that come to conclusions that are not real conclusions, right? The biggest one that I see most commonly is correlation is not causation. We read a ton of studies that show two things that happen similarly, right? So if you take this drug, you stop having heart attacks, right? So depending on how the experiment is laid out, just because you're taking the drug, it doesn't mean the drug is what's reducing the heart attacks, right? There's a lot of other factors to consider. I mean, that drug could be destroying another part of your body that's slowing your heart down, right? And damaging your heart in a different way, or putting your heart under a different kind of stress that's reducing what you see as heart attacks. The way the study's executed could be hiding heart attacks, essentially. The length and duration of the study could have an impact on all this. All this stuff, it plays a role, right? So if we don't apply reason in the correct manner, then we could see causation when it's only correlation. These things are not mutually exclusive. So that's just an idea of some of the things that I'm looking to explore and share, so that people, again, can think critically for themselves about what's going on out there and make their own decisions. I would never ask anyone or even want anyone to listen strictly to me. I want you to form your own ideas and make your own decisions. And it's the diversity of thought between me and you that will yield something really radical and something amazing and something that will change the unpleasant things that are happening around us. So that kind of brings us up to present day. This cast ended up being way longer than I thought it would, but I'm really happy with it. I hope you're happy with it. I'm hoping to shoot these out in a pretty regular succession, but that'll depend on the material I can get together and the guests I can get together. If anyone wants to be on the cast, has something valuable they think they contribute, everybody needs to hear, please reach out to me. I don't plan on this thing being massively popular. I plan on this being the truth that no one wants to hear, so no one listens to. But I know there are people that I know, friends that I have, people in the community that need to hear this stuff, need to understand it, and there's a lot of confusion out there, and there's not as much help as we'd probably like. So that's my aim for the cast. I hope you're all doing as well as you can be, and thanks for tuning in.